What if I told you there are recordings, secret tapes, that capture words the world was never meant to hear? Words that could unravel the carefully maintained image of one of the most powerful women in modern royalty. Words that allegedly come from Meghan Markle, whispered, or perhaps veiled as threats, towards someone deep inside the palace, someone trusted with secrets about Archie's birth. You might be asking yourself, how could such a thing exist? And why, now, is it being revealed? Well, the answers are stranger, darker, and far more shocking than you could ever imagine. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Picture this, a dimly lit room, somewhere in the quiet corners of Windsor Castle. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson sit side by side, faces tense, the faint glow of a table lamp reflecting off the polished wood. Their eyes are fixed on a recording device, the kind that feels almost antique, like it has been hiding a dangerous secret for years. Every so often, Fergie's fingers drum nervously against her thigh. Andrew's jaw tightens, and the silence between the words on the tape grows heavier with each passing second. They had been told the content of the recordings might be concerning, but nothing could have prepared them for the emotional weight of what they were about to hear. The words were sharp, deliberate, and at times, chilling. Why now, you may wonder? Why reveal such intimate, potentially explosive material at this moment? The answer lies in the intersection of secrecy, fear, and responsibility. For decades, the monarchy has managed its image meticulously, controlling every leak, every narrative, and every scandal. But the world is changing. Secrets that were once safely tucked behind palace doors now have a way of escaping. And for Andrew and Fergie, sitting there listening to these tapes, the choice became clear. It was time the world heard the truth. But let's take a step back. Before we get lost in the web of threats and secrets, it's important to understand what's at stake. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, has always been a polarizing figure, loved by some, scrutinized by others, and analyzed endlessly by the media. She married into one of the oldest monarchies in the world, a family whose every move is documented, dissected, and broadcasted. To outsiders, the palace seems like a world of glittering events, formal ceremonies, and the occasional scandal. But inside, the dynamics are complex, charged with decades of protocol, expectation, and sometimes manipulation. Now imagine someone entering that world with a mission, someone determined to protect not just her family, but the narrative of her child. Meghan, in this scenario, is alleged to have wielded words as weapons, issuing veiled threats to an insider who possessed sensitive information about Archie's birth. We don't yet know the full content of these tapes, but Andrew and Fergie's reactions tell us everything we need to know. They were shocked, unsettled, and compelled to act. This isn't idle gossip or palace rumor. It's a revelation that could ripple through the monarchy in ways the public has never seen. You might be thinking, was this a misunderstanding? Could the words have been misinterpreted? Perhaps. But Andrew and Fergie, who have lived within the royal sphere long enough to understand nuance, tone, and intent, believe there is more here than meets the eye. The tapes capture something deliberate, something calculated, and most importantly, something that the world deserves to hear. And yet, the story is not just about Meghan. It's about loyalty, discretion, and the crushing weight of knowing a secret. Andrew, a man who has weathered countless controversies himself, listens with a mixture of disbelief and resolve. Fergie, whose compassion is well known, feels an undeniable mix of fear and indignation. Both understand the stakes. The insider could face consequences, the family could be affected, and the monarchy itself could be thrust into an unprecedented moral and public crisis. Think about it from your own perspective for a moment. How would you feel if someone you trusted, someone sworn to confidentiality, was being intimidated? How would it feel to sit in silence, to absorb words meant to manipulate, while the clock ticks and history hangs in the balance? This is exactly the emotional tension that Andrew and Fergie were experiencing, and it's what makes this story so compelling. It's not simply a tale of palace intrigue. It's a deeply human story of fear, power, and the courage it takes to confront uncomfortable truths. As we explore these recordings, it's essential to understand the broader context. Archie Harrison, the child at the center of this storm, is not just any baby. He is the next generation of a lineage steeped in tradition, expectation, and, as this story will reveal, controversy. Every decision regarding his protection, privacy, and public image is magnified under the intense scrutiny of the press and the public alike. And when whispers of coercion or intimidation enter that picture, the stakes become monumental. The tapes, Andrew and Fergie insist, are not about vilifying anyone unnecessarily. They are about exposing a truth that has been kept in the shadows, perhaps to the detriment of everyone involved. Here's something to consider. Power in the palace is rarely straightforward. It's subtle, pervasive, and often hidden beneath layers of protocol and tradition. A single word, a carefully placed threat, can alter decisions, manipulate outcomes, and change relationships forever. If these recordings are authentic, they represent more than just personal conflict. They are a window into the hidden mechanisms of influence and control that operate behind closed doors. Andrew and Fergie, with decades of experience navigating this world, recognized the gravity of what they were hearing immediately. And yet, there is a twist. The palace, while accustomed to secrets and discretion, is also a living institution, constantly interacting with public perception. Andrew and Fergie knew that revealing these tapes would not only expose Meghan's alleged behavior, but also test the monarchy's resilience, loyalty, and credibility. It's a balancing act between truth and chaos, between protecting individuals and protecting an institution. And that tension is precisely why this story matters more than ever. As you listen, or in this case, as you watch and read, consider this. Every word on those tapes carries weight. Every nuance, every pause, every inflection is a piece of a puzzle that could rewrite what the public thinks they know about Meghan, Archie, and the royal household. Andrew and Fergie have spent years in this world, and they are the guides taking us through this maze of secrecy, fear, and revelation. Their perspective adds layers of credibility and emotional depth to a story that is already electric with suspense. So why now? Why reveal this after all this time? The answer, Andrew and Fergie say, is simple. The world deserves the truth. And the truth, they insist, cannot wait any longer. It is not a question of revenge or malice. It is a question of transparency, justice, and, perhaps most importantly, the protection of innocence. Archie, as a child, is at the center of these swirling forces, and it is this protective instinct that compelled Andrew and Fergie to step forward. But the tension does not end there. Listening to the tapes is one thing. Acting upon them is quite another. What comes next is a complex web of ethical dilemmas, potential backlash, and the raw human emotion that we rarely see in royal circles. Will the insider remain silent, or will the exposure ignite further confrontation? How will Meghan respond if confronted publicly or privately? And perhaps most intriguingly, how will the public react when these private words are finally brought into the light? As we move forward into the chapters of this story, keep one question in mind. If you were in Andrew and Fergie's shoes, would you have the courage to speak out? Would you risk scandal, judgment, and criticism for the sake of transparency? Or would you stay silent, as so many before have done, preserving the peace while knowing the truth remains locked away? This is the central tension that drives every moment of this narrative and keeps the stakes impossibly high. And just when you think you have a sense of where this is going, consider this. What if the recordings reveal not just threats, but manipulation so subtle, so carefully orchestrated, that it changes the very foundation of our understanding of the events surrounding Archie's birth? What if words we think we understand turn out to carry double meanings, implications that only the most observant ears could detect? Andrew and Fergie, seasoned and cautious, were taken aback by the layers of meaning, the hidden intentions that the tapes conveyed. As we begin this journey together, one thing is clear. We are entering a world of power, secrecy, and human emotion rarely seen beyond palace walls. The stakes are enormous, the characters are complex, and the revelations are shocking. Andrew and Fergie have promised us one thing. It's time the world hears the truth. And as we start peeling back the layers, one question hangs over everything. What will the world do with this truth once it is revealed? What if the secrets of the palace were hiding in plain sight, recorded, and waiting to be discovered by the people they affected most? That's exactly what happened the night Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson first laid eyes on the tapes. It wasn't a casual discovery, nor was it a story whispered down palace corridors. This was deliberate. Someone had recorded private conversations, carefully preserved them, and, as Andrew and Fergie would soon learn, exposed a side of Meghan Markle that few had ever seen. It began quietly. Andrew had received a call from a trusted aide, a whisper at first, almost cautious, almost conspiratorial. "You need to hear this," the aide had said, voice tight with concern. "It's about Meghan, about Archie, and it's about the recordings." Andrew felt a chill. Recordings? In his years of royal life, he had seen leaks, press manipulations, and even betrayals, but recordings were different. A recording meant permanence. Unlike a rumor or an offhand comment, words captured on tape are tangible, undeniable, and unchangeable. And if those words were damaging, the consequences could be immediate and severe. Sarah Ferguson, sitting nearby during the call, felt a familiar tension settle over her. She had long lived under the same palace rules as Andrew, navigating scrutiny, public opinion, and private crises. Her instincts told her this was serious. "Show us," she said quietly, her voice calm but resolute. There was no room for hesitation. Andrew agreed. The next day, in a small, dimly lit room away from the bustle of the palace, the aide handed over the recordings. The tapes were unassuming at first glance. A simple digital recorder, ordinary in appearance. But what it held within its memory was anything but ordinary. Andrew and Fergie glanced at each other, the weight of anticipation palpable. Both had been through scandals, both had navigated crises, but this was different. This was personal. This was about a child, about loyalty, about threats that, if true, would expose a raw, manipulative side of someone the public had come to know very differently. They pressed play. At first, there was only silence, punctuated by faint static. Then, a voice emerged, familiar, calm, but with an unmistakable edge. Meghan's words, though measured, carried intention. The way she enunciated certain phrases, the pauses she left between sentences, the subtle inflection, it all suggested more than simple conversation. These were words designed to influence, words designed to intimidate. Even Andrew, who had grown accustomed to palace politics and media storms, found himself taken aback. Sarah's reaction was visceral. Her hand went to her mouth, a subconscious gesture of shock and concern. "I've never heard anything like this," she whispered. Not from anyone. The two of them listened, hour after hour, replaying sections to understand context, tone, and implications. What they discovered was chilling. The recordings seemed to show Meghan carefully maneuvering, ensuring the insider understood the stakes of keeping information private. The way she spoke, veiled yet precise, suggested awareness, strategy, and, some would argue, coercion. And yet, the tapes also revealed something more complex, a human side. Between the moments of tension, there were glimpses of vulnerability, moments when the weight of motherhood, protection, and public scrutiny seemed to surface. Andrew and Fergie noticed it immediately. This was not a simple narrative of malice. It was layered, nuanced, and difficult to categorize. That complexity made the recordings all the more compelling and all the more dangerous. It was Andrew who first suggested they step back and consider the implications. "We need to understand everything before we act," he said. His words were deliberate, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't just about us. It's about truth, protection, and the consequences of revealing it." Fergie nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility. They were no strangers to public scrutiny. They knew the backlash that could come from exposing secrets. But this time, the stakes were higher. This wasn't about them. It was about a child, about trust, and about accountability. The more they listened, the more they realized the recordings might not be isolated. References to meetings, notes, and interactions suggested there could be other tapes, other moments, capturing conversations that had previously gone unnoticed. The palace, Andrew and Fergie understood, had always relied on discretion, silence, and tradition to manage delicate situations. But these recordings bypassed all of that. They were tangible evidence, frozen in time, impossible to ignore. As the hours passed, the tension in the room escalated. Fergie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Do we even know who made these?" she asked quietly. The aide who had brought them insisted it was someone with legitimate access, someone bound by confidentiality, but willing to reveal the truth. It wasn't done lightly, the aide said. They felt it was necessary. For Archie, for the family. That explanation did little to soothe their anxiety. It was one thing to hear words spoken. It was another to realize someone had made a conscious choice to record them, knowing the implications could be devastating. Andrew, as ever, was methodical. He began cataloging what they had, making notes about timestamps, context, and possible motives. Every detail mattered, a subtle shift in tone, a pause, an emphasis on a single word. Fergie, meanwhile, focused on emotional cues, moments where the voice betrayed tension, fear, or determination. Together, they pieced together a narrative that was becoming increasingly alarming. Yet there was a question that loomed larger than all others. Why reveal these recordings now? Megan's public image had been carefully managed for years, and Andrew and Fergie understood the careful orchestration of perception. If the tapes were released prematurely or interpreted incorrectly, they could ignite a firestorm, not just in the press, but within the monarchy itself. And yet, sitting in that quiet room, both Andrew and Fergie felt a growing urgency. The world deserved to hear this, they decided. The stakes were too high, the potential consequences too serious, and the moral responsibility undeniable. What made the tapes even more remarkable was what they suggested about power dynamics inside the palace. Meghan's voice, calm yet assertive, revealed an understanding of influence, an ability to navigate complex social hierarchies, and a strategic approach to protecting her family's interests. Some might see this as manipulation, others might view it as protective instinct. The truth, as Andrew and Fergie realized, was complicated. The recordings captured not just a moment of tension, but a window into the intricate web of relationships, loyalties, and pressures that define royal life. And then came the moment that changed everything. A particular segment of the tape, subtle but unmistakable, suggested awareness beyond what anyone had anticipated. Meghan referred indirectly to information that the insider had not yet revealed publicly. Her words implied consequences, hinted at potential exposure, and carried an unmistakable weight. Andrew and Fergie exchanged glances, realizing that the implications were enormous. This wasn't just about Archie's birth or private information. It was about control, influence, and the lengths someone might go to ensure their narrative prevailed. By the end of that first night, Andrew and Fergie knew one thing with absolute clarity. These recordings could not remain unheard. They had the potential to reshape public understanding, challenge assumptions, and reveal a side of palace life that few ever glimpse. And yet, the responsibility weighed heavily on them. How to act without causing irreparable damage. How to honor the truth while navigating the labyrinthine protocols of royal life. The evening closed with a moment of silence. Fergie leaned back, rubbing her temples, and whispered, "This changes everything." Andrew nodded slowly, staring at the recorder, knowing that the decision they were about to make could reverberate far beyond the walls of the palace. These tapes, ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in content, held the power to ignite a storm the monarchy had never anticipated. And just as they prepared to step away, the aide quietly said something that made both of them freeze. "You should know, there's one more recording, and it might be the most revealing of all." Who is the person at the center of these recordings? The one Meghan allegedly directed her words toward? The answer is not simple, because the palace operates on layers of secrecy, hierarchy, and trust that few outsiders ever glimpse. This is the royal insider, a figure whose life is defined by discretion, loyalty, and access to sensitive information few could ever imagine. Without them, many events would remain obscured. With them, the inner workings of the monarchy become frighteningly transparent. Imagine a life where your every action, every word, and even your silences carry consequence. That is the world of the royal insider. They are not a celebrity or a public figure. They are invisible to the world, operating behind the curtains, managing delicate interactions, and keeping the machinery of the monarchy functioning smoothly. Their responsibilities are immense. From private correspondences to coordinating events, to knowing who can see whom and when. And above all, they are the guardians of the family's most intimate secrets. For Andrew and Fergie, Understanding the insider's position was crucial. They needed to grasp not only the context of the recordings, but also the immense pressures this individual faces daily. The insider isn't just a witness to the palace's inner workings. They are a participant in a high-stakes game where a single misstep can alter reputations, careers, and relationships. Fergie, who has always been attuned to human emotion, immediately recognized the courage it must have taken for someone in this position to come forward. Andrew, cautious and methodical, understood the risks. Any exposure could lead to public scrutiny, legal challenges, and potential fallout within the palace. This insider is more than just a neutral observer. They are a linchpin, a person who balances loyalty to the royal family with their own moral compass. They see the nuances of palace life that outsiders cannot. Whispered tensions during state dinners, private conflicts behind closed doors, and moments where public appearances mask deeply personal disputes. They navigate a world of contradictions, power and vulnerability, secrecy and transparency, loyalty and fear. And in this case, they were at the crossroads of perhaps the most delicate situation the monarchy had faced in decades: the controversy surrounding Archie's birth and Meghan's alleged threats. Andrew and Fergie began piecing together the insider's role. From organizing confidential meetings to handling communications that never reached the public eye, the insider's responsibilities were vast. They are not simply a messenger or an assistant. They are a guardian of truth, sometimes carrying information that could ignite scandal if mishandled. And this is exactly what made the recordings so explosive. The insider was in possession of knowledge Meghan allegedly wanted to control, and the tension between protective instinct and potential exposure became palpable in every word captured on tape. It's hard to overstate the gravity of this position. Imagine knowing that a single disclosure could affect the life of a child, alter public perception, or even destabilize relationships within one of the world's most scrutinized families. Now imagine being threatened, subtly, carefully, deliberately, for that knowledge. That is the reality the insider faced. And Andrew and Fergie understood it immediately. The tapes were not merely about private information. They were about control, influence, and the immense responsibility that comes with access to sensitive truths. Fergie, reflecting on the first time she and Andrew listened to the recordings, said quietly, "You could hear the weight of it in every word." The insider wasn't just being threatened, they were being cornered. Andrew agreed, noting that the subtlety of Meghan's language was remarkable. There were no overt statements, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there were pauses, inflections, carefully chosen phrases that implied consequences without stating them outright. It was a masterclass in psychological pressure, and the insider was caught squarely in the middle. For the insider, the stakes were personal as well as professional. They had to navigate their own ethics, deciding whether to stay silent, comply, or risk exposure. Silence could mean protecting the monarchy's image, but at the cost of personal peace and potentially compromising moral integrity. Speaking out could bring attention, criticism, and backlash, not just from the public, but from powerful figures within the royal family itself. It was a delicate balance, one that few could manage without trembling under the pressure. Andrew and Fergie also considered the human dimension: fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. The insider had to weigh the implications of every action against the backdrop of intense public scrutiny. Even a rumor could spark international headlines. Every decision carried emotional weight. Andrew, who had endured his own share of scandals and controversies, empathized with the insider's position. Fergie, sensitive to human emotion and instinctively protective, felt the urgency of their predicament. Both recognized that understanding this perspective was key to navigating the recordings responsibly. And yet, the insider's courage is what made the revelations possible. They didn't simply record private conversations for sensationalism or personal gain. According to Andrew and Fergie, the tapes were created to document what had been happening, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as a safeguard. The insider understood the stakes, and they recognized that silence would only allow the situation to fester. They acted with calculated intention, knowing full well that these recordings could alter lives, reputations, and the public perception of everyone involved. As Andrew and Fergie listened to the tapes over and over, they began to understand more about the insider's life. There were references to meetings where Archie's birth had been discussed, notes taken with precision, and subtle cues indicating Megan's awareness of the insider's knowledge. Every detail mattered. Andrew and Fergie cataloged it meticulously. Timestamps, context, tone, and even the ambient sounds captured in the recordings. Each element added depth to the narrative and reinforced the complexity of the situation. This insider also operates in a world of contradictions. They are bound by confidentiality, yet they must act in the best interest of the family and, in this case, the child. Their position is delicate. They must navigate threats, implied or otherwise, while maintaining professionalism and composure. Andrew and Fergie, seasoned by decades of royal life, knew that such a person required both courage and wisdom. The tapes revealed this in every word, every pause, every subtle threat that Meghan allegedly made. There's another layer here that Andrew and Fergie recognized immediately: the moral and ethical implications. The insider had to make choices not only about what to say and do, but also about how to interpret the intent behind Meghan's words. Were they protective? Were they manipulative? Were they calculated to intimidate? Each interpretation had profound consequences. And in listening to the recordings, Andrew and Fergie realized that understanding the insider's perspective was essential to understanding the full story. For the audience, it's worth pausing and asking, could you handle such responsibility? Could you carry knowledge that, if revealed, could alter the course of a family's life, a child's future, and the perception of one of the world's most powerful households? The insider is doing this constantly, navigating a labyrinth of secrecy, loyalty, and personal ethics. And as Andrew and Fergie discovered, the tension is palpable. By the end of the day, Andrew and Fergie had a clear picture. The insider's world is not glamorous. It is high pressure, fraught with moral dilemmas, and shadowed by the constant awareness that every action carries weight. And yet, it is this very world that allowed the recordings to exist in the first place. Without someone in this position, with access and foresight, the secrets would have remained buried, the threats unrecorded, and the truth locked away. And just when Andrew and Fergie thought they had absorbed everything, the aide handed them a note, scribbled quickly. There's more. Something you need to hear before you react. Andrew raised an eyebrow. Fergie's eyes widened. They had already faced hours of shocking revelations, had navigated layers of fear and tension, and yet, the possibility of another layer loomed. The insider's world was complex, secretive, and dangerous. It was a world few could survive emotionally intact, and Andrew and Fergie realized that understanding it fully was not optional. It was essential. Because the next revelation, they knew, would push all boundaries further, testing not only their patience, but their very understanding of what loyalty, secrecy, and truth really meant. Some words are meant to be private. Others are meant to terrify. And according to Andrew and Fergie, Meghan Markle's voice on these recordings fell firmly into the second category. From the moment they pressed play, it was clear this wasn't casual conversation. This was carefully calculated, deliberate communication, words crafted with precision to send a message, a warning, a veiled threat to the insider about sensitive information regarding Archie's birth. Imagine being in that room with them, listening as a voice you've heard in interviews, public appearances, and media events suddenly takes on an entirely different texture. It's calm, measured, even polite, but underneath, there is an unmistakable edge. Every pause, every syllable, every carefully chosen word carries intention. Meghan allegedly isn't just speaking. She is maneuvering, steering, and controlling. Andrew leaned forward, brow furrowed. Fergie's fingers twisted in her lap. Both understood immediately that these weren't idle words. They were strategic, designed to influence and unsettle. The first segment of the recordings is subtle, almost innocuous. On the surface, Meghan appears concerned, perhaps protective, about her child and the privacy surrounding his birth. But the nuances reveal something more insidious. There's an underlying tone, a calculated tension that Andrew described as sharp as a blade hidden in silk. Every phrase carries dual meaning. On the surface, Meghan is expressing care. Beneath it, there is a quiet insistence that boundaries be respected, that compliance be enforced, that consequences for disobedience are implied. Fergie noted something immediately. The phrasing is deliberate. Meghan doesn't yell, doesn't make overt demands. Instead, she plants seeds of anxiety, hints at outcomes, and leaves pauses that feel heavy, like a warning hanging in the air. To an untrained ear, it might sound like standard conversation, but Andrew and Fergie, seasoned by decades of palace observation, recognized the pattern instantly. This is someone using language as a tool of influence, shaping perception, and asserting control without ever overtly stating it. One moment in particular caused both Andrew and Fergie to pause the tape. Meghan's voice, calm yet firm, suggested that withholding information about Archie could have serious consequences. Not legal consequences, not public fallout. Personal consequences, private discomfort, implications that could ripple through relationships and trust within the palace. Andrew's reaction was instinctive. He leaned back in disbelief, trying to process the precision and weight of the language. Fergie, on the other hand, felt a mixture of fear and concern. "This is calculated," she whispered. "Every word is intentional. This isn't just about protection, it's about power." And yet, there is complexity here. While the recordings suggest veiled threats, they also reflect a maternal instinct, a protective drive that many parents can relate to. Meghan's voice carries concern for her child, urgency about privacy, and the need to control the narrative surrounding Archie. It's a duality that makes the recordings difficult to interpret, yet impossible to ignore. The listener is caught between fear of coercion and understanding the instinct to safeguard one's family. Andrew and Fergie understood this immediately. They had to navigate the emotional layers to understand the truth of the situation. Throughout the recordings, Meghan allegedly employs techniques that are psychologically sophisticated. There are pauses that create tension, phrases that imply consequences without spelling them out, and subtle references to past actions that remind the insider of what is at stake. Fergie noted that this is not simple intimidation. It is a nuanced orchestration of influence, a dance between persuasion and subtle pressure. Andrew, more methodical, began documenting every instance, noting tone, inflection, and implied meaning. Together, they began to map the dynamics at play, a blueprint of power, control, and maternal protectiveness intertwined with psychological strategy. The insider, of course, is not a passive listener. From what Andrew and Fergie could gather, there is a palpable tension in their responses, hesitation, careful wording, and cautious acknowledgement of the threats. They are aware of the stakes, of the potential fallout if they reveal information, and of the subtle, insistent pressure being applied to them. The recordings capture this dynamic perfectly. Meghan speaking with intent, the insider listening with caution, and the invisible line between compliance and defiance vibrating in every word. There are moments that are particularly chilling. At one point, Meghan allegedly references information only the insider would know, a detail that underscores the level of awareness and strategic foresight she allegedly possesses. Andrew and Fergie both recognized it immediately. This was not a coincidence, not a casual reference. It was an intentional reminder that the insider's actions, or inactions, had consequences. The weight of this knowledge, captured in crisp, deliberate language, was palpable. The tape seemed almost to hum with the tension of unspoken consequences, each moment pregnant with implication. And yet, there is something strangely human in these alleged threats. Fergie observed that beneath the intensity, there is vulnerability, a sense of urgency, and at times, frustration. Meghan's words reflect the pressure of motherhood, public scrutiny, and the constant need to safeguard a child from the prying eyes of the media and even palace insiders. Andrew added that this layered complexity makes the recordings uniquely powerful. They reveal someone simultaneously protective, strategic, and willing to exert influence in ways few could imagine. For Andrew and Fergie, processing the recordings is a delicate task. On one hand, they must consider the implications of Meghan's alleged threats. The emotional and psychological weight placed on the insider, the potential consequences for trust within the palace, and the broader public perception if these tapes were ever revealed. On the other hand, they must navigate the reality that these recordings could provide crucial insight into behavior, motivation, and the hidden dynamics surrounding Archie's birth. It's a balancing act between understanding, interpretation, and responsibility. Andrew, experienced in navigating palace crises, noted the strategic elements immediately. He understood that Meghan's alleged approach is both deliberate and effective, leveraging subtle pressure, implied consequences, and psychological nuance. Fergie, attuned to the human side of this, focused on the emotional impact, the fear, tension, and anxiety that these words would inevitably produce in anyone listening. Together, they synthesized the recordings, building a picture that was as disturbing as it was revealing. There's another element that cannot be ignored: the context. The palace is an environment of hierarchy, protocol, and scrutiny. Every word carries meaning, every gesture is observed, and every interaction is analyzed. In this setting, a veiled threat is not merely a comment. It is a statement of power. Meghan's alleged threats, as captured on tape, are amplified by the context in which they were made. The insider, already operating under immense pressure, is now subject to a layer of psychological tension that few outside the palace can comprehend. The implications for the insider are immense. Compliance becomes a survival mechanism. Silence becomes a shield. And every decision carries moral and ethical weight. Andrew and Fergie recognized this immediately. They were not listening to idle gossip or palace drama. They were witnessing a high-stakes psychological engagement, a battle of influence and control that could have long-term consequences for relationships, trust, and the reputation of those involved. As the night wore on, Andrew and Fergie continued to analyze the recordings, replaying segments, noting subtle cues, and piecing together the story. Each phrase, each pause, each inflection added depth to the narrative. And the more they listened, the more they realized that these were not isolated incidents. The alleged threats were part of a broader strategy, a pattern of behavior designed to influence, control, and protect. By the end of the evening, one thing was certain: the recordings were a revelation. They captured a side of Meghan Markle that few had ever witnessed publicly, a combination of strategy, protection, and subtle intimidation. Andrew and Fergie understood the gravity of what they were hearing and the responsibility they now carried. The tapes could not remain unheard. They demanded scrutiny, reflection, and, ultimately, disclosure. And then came the moment that would leave both of them breathless. A segment of the recording revealed an implied consequence, one so subtle, yet so clear that it sent chills down their spines. It was a phrase, barely audible, that hinted at outcomes the insider could not ignore. Andrew paused the tape. Fergie stared at him, eyes wide, understanding immediately. This was not a simple threat. This was a statement, a calculated maneuver, and a moment that would change the course of how they viewed the entire situation. They had heard the recordings. They had felt the tension, the subtle pressure, the veiled implications. But hearing is only the beginning. Understanding, processing, and reacting, that is where the real test begins. For Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, the moment they pressed pause on that tape, the gravity of the situation became fully clear. They weren't just listening to words on a device. They were facing the intersection of power, family, and morality, and it demanded a reaction unlike any they had navigated before. Andrew leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, mind racing through decades of palace experience. He had seen scandals erupt, reputations crumble, and careers end with a single misstep. He understood the delicate balance of public image and private reality better than most. Yet, even with his experience, the recordings left him unsettled. He was aware of the intricate layers: Meghan's voice carrying subtle threats, the insider grappling with pressure, and the delicate position of the monarchy itself. Every nuance mattered. Every pause, every inflection, was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of influence. Fergie, sitting across from him, absorbed the emotional weight differently. She instinctively felt the tension, the fear, the anxiety that the insider must have felt under the implied threat. Her first thought was empathy. She knew the human side of these moments, the emotional strain, the sense of being cornered, and the moral burden that comes with knowledge. "This isn't just words," she whispered, almost to herself. "This is power, and it's being wielded carefully." Their reactions were a mix of instinct, emotion, and strategic thinking. Andrew, methodical and cautious, began to dissect the content. He noted every potential implication, every subtle cue that suggested intent. Fergie, intuitive and empathetic, focused on the human consequences, the fear, the vulnerability, and the psychological pressure the insider endured. Together, they began forming a picture that was both alarming and fascinating, a layered understanding of control, influence, and protection. Andrew broke the silence first. "This is unlike anything I've seen," he said, voice measured. "It's not just the words. It's the intention behind them. Whoever is hearing this, they're being guided, pressured, and manipulated simultaneously." Fergie nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There was a precision to Megan's language that was chilling. The words were designed to achieve compliance, to subtly instill anxiety, and to ensure the insider understood the stakes without an outright threat. It was a masterclass in psychological influence. And yet, there was also a human element. Beneath the tension, the strategic maneuvering, and the implied threats, there were traces of concern, urgency, and protectiveness. Megan's voice suggested a deep investment in her child's well-being and privacy. Andrew and Fergie recognized the duality immediately. These were not just threats. They were layered communications, a combination of maternal instinct and strategic persuasion. Understanding this complexity was key to navigating their response. Their next step was discussion. They talked in hushed tones, weighing options, considering consequences. How should they act on this knowledge? Should they confront Megan? Should they remain silent? Could they even share this with anyone else without triggering scandal? The stakes were monumental. The insider's position, the child's privacy, and the public perception of the royal family all hung in the balance. One wrong move could set off a chain reaction with consequences that no one could fully predict. Fergie's instinct was immediate: protect the vulnerable, which in this case was both the insider and Archie. "We have to consider what this means for the child," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "The child's privacy, safety, and well-being are paramount. Everything else must follow." Andrew agreed, though he approached it differently. His focus was on strategy. Understanding the broader implications, anticipating reactions, and navigating the complex web of palace dynamics. Together, they formed a plan, not just of immediate response, but of long-term consideration, a roadmap that accounted for emotion, loyalty, and responsibility. But there was an immediate challenge: how to reconcile the gravity of the alleged threats with the human element. Andrew noted that Megan's voice carried authority, calculated pauses, and subtle inflections that conveyed both concern and intent. Fergie pointed out moments where maternal instinct and protective behavior were unmistakable. The two perspectives combined to form a nuanced understanding. These recordings were not one-dimensional. They were multifaceted, reflecting both strategy and instinct, pressure and protection. In the following hours, they began replaying sections of the recordings repeatedly. Each time, a new nuance emerged, a subtle implication that had been missed before. Andrew meticulously documented every segment, noting timestamps, phrases, and potential interpretations. Fergie focused on emotional cues, interpreting tone, cadence, and inflection to gauge intent. Together, they mapped the dynamics of the situation, a blueprint of tension, influence, and psychological complexity. At one point, a particular phrase caused Fergie to pause the recording. "Listen to this," she said, pointing at the waveform. "The pause here, it's deliberate. It's not just a pause, it's a message." Andrew nodded. The silence between the words carried weight, an implied consequence that was unmistakable. The insider, hearing this, would have felt the pressure immediately. This was not casual speech. This was calculated communication, precise in its delivery and intent. The emotional weight was enormous. Andrew felt a mixture of concern, incredulity, and responsibility. Fergie felt fear, empathy, and urgency. Both recognized the ethical dilemma: how to act without causing undue harm, how to protect the vulnerable, and how to uphold the integrity of the monarchy. The recordings had forced them into a position that no royal parent or advisor wants to be in. They were not merely listeners. They were witnesses, interpreters, and potential actors in a situation fraught with consequence. Their reactions also included a recognition of human complexity. Meghan's words, while strategic, were also motivated by protectiveness, maternal instinct, and the pressures of living under constant public scrutiny. Andrew and Fergie understood that this duality made the situation more complicated. The recordings were evidence of tension and influence, yes. But they were also evidence of care, urgency, and the length someone might go to safeguard what they love most. The discussion turned to possible outcomes. If these recordings were ever made public, the implications could be enormous. Media scrutiny, palace response, and public reaction all had to be considered. They also had to consider the insider, who could face significant pressure and possible retaliation. Andrew and Fergie recognized that any misstep could ignite a firestorm, not just in the media, but within the palace itself. They were aware of the delicate balance between truth, transparency, and discretion, and that balance was more precarious than ever. Andrew suggested that they needed a structured approach. "We have to separate fact from interpretation," he said. "We need to understand what's being said, why it's being said, and what the consequences might be." Fergie agreed, emphasizing the need to protect the vulnerable. Together, they began outlining steps, weighing ethical considerations against practical implications, and preparing for the possibility that these recordings could, and perhaps should, be shared under controlled circumstances. And yet, despite their careful analysis, both felt the gravity of the personal stakes. This was not just about strategy or ethics, it was about family, trust, and responsibility. The insider's safety, Archie's privacy, and the integrity of the monarchy were all intertwined in a delicate web. One wrong move, one misinterpretation, could have far-reaching consequences. Andrew and Fergie were acutely aware that they were now players in a situation far larger than themselves, navigating a high-stakes moral and emotional landscape. As the night drew on, they continued to listen, to interpret, and to plan. Every replay revealed new layers. Subtleties in tone, implications in phrasing, and the hidden complexity of influence and control. The recordings were more than just evidence. They were a masterclass in strategic communication, revealing a depth of intention that was both chilling and revealing. Andrew and Fergie were forced to confront not just the content, but the context and the emotional and ethical implications of what they had heard. By the early hours of the morning, they reached a consensus. These recordings could not remain unheard. They had the potential to expose truths, protect the vulnerable, and illuminate aspects of palace life that the public had never seen. But they also recognized the responsibility, the need to act with care, discernment, and precision. The decisions they made in the coming days would shape not only public understanding, but the internal dynamics of the royal household. And just when they thought they had processed everything, the aide spoke again, quietly, almost reverently. "There's one more part of the recording. It's subtle, but it might be the most revealing of all." Andrew and Fergie exchanged a glance, understanding immediately that their journey was far from over. They had prepared for surprises, but this suggested a depth they had not yet encountered. Every royal birth carries significance. Every new life introduced to the monarchy carries expectation, tradition, and, increasingly, public scrutiny. But some births, some arrivals into the world, carry stakes so high they ripple far beyond nursery walls. Archie Harrison's birth was one of those moments. And as Andrew and Fergie began to understand the recordings, they realized the threats, veiled or otherwise, were not just words. They were part of a much larger web of stakes, secrecy, and consequences that few outside the palace could ever comprehend. It began with context. The birth of Archie, son of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, was already wrapped in layers of secrecy and tension. From the very beginning, the world watched closely, the press hungry for every detail. The palace's traditional protocols clashed with modern media expectations. Privacy, once taken for granted, became a scarce commodity. Every statement, every photograph, every leak, or absence thereof, was magnified under a global spotlight. And in this pressure cooker environment, the recordings that Andrew and Fergie had listened to suddenly took on an entirely different dimension. Think about it. The stakes of Archie's birth weren't limited to the personal joy of parents welcoming a child. They encompassed lineage, succession, public perception, and even the internal dynamics of the royal family. A single piece of information, a single leaked detail, could alter the perception of the monarchy, ignite controversy, or destabilize carefully maintained relationships. Meghan's alleged veiled threats, captured in the recordings, were, in part, a reflection of the awareness of these stakes. The stakes were enormous, and the pressure on the insider, to manage the truth, to maintain discretion, and to navigate the demands of a determined mother, was almost unbearable. Andrew, analyzing the recordings, immediately recognized the dual layers of significance. On one level, Meghan's voice conveyed protection, maternal instinct guarding her child from unwanted exposure. But on another level, it conveyed control, a strategic maneuver designed to ensure that sensitive information remained private. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, every implied consequence was a signal to the insider. The stakes are high, the consequence is real, and the line between compliance and breach is thin. Fergie, attuned to human emotion and instinctive empathy, immediately saw the psychological weight on both sides. The insider, though professional, was human. They could feel pressure, anxiety, and even fear. The recordings revealed that Meghan understood this, leveraging subtle cues to convey her point. The messages were sophisticated, layered with intent, and, at times, chilling in their effectiveness. For Andrew and Fergie, the emotional impact was immediate. The tapes were not merely informative, they were visceral. They felt the tension, the stakes, and the potential fallout as if they were in the room themselves. Why was Archie's birth so sensitive? It wasn't simply a matter of privacy. It was a matter of lineage and legacy. Every royal child is more than just a family member. They are a symbol of continuity, tradition, and expectation. The public and the palace alike attach layers of significance to their arrivals. Archie's birth represented a bridge between tradition and modernity, between the royal establishment and a changing world. And in this delicate balance, information becomes currency, discretion becomes power, and influence becomes a tool that can protect or destabilize. The insider, of course, understood this implicitly. Their position required them to manage the flow of sensitive information, to maintain confidentiality, and to navigate the pressures of both public interest and private responsibility. But when Meghan allegedly issued veiled threats, she effectively raised the stakes. Compliance was no longer just a matter of professionalism. It was a matter of consequence. The recordings captured this dynamic with stark clarity. The child's privacy, the family's reputation, and the insider's responsibility were intertwined in a complex, high-pressure equation. Andrew and Fergie spent hours analyzing specific segments of the recordings that referred directly to Archie. The phrasing was deliberate, calculated, and unmistakable in its intent. Meghan's voice suggested awareness not only of what the insider knew, but of what they might consider revealing. There were pauses, subtle shifts in tone, and inflections that implied outcomes without stating them outright. It was strategy layered with maternal concern, influence interwoven with protection. The psychological sophistication was clear, and it was unnerving. Yet, the recordings also revealed contradiction. At times, Meghan's voice softened, reflecting vulnerability and genuine concern for her child. These moments of tenderness were juxtaposed against segments of precise, controlled language designed to ensure the insider understood boundaries and the stakes involved. Andrew and Fergie noted the contrast immediately. This duality made the recordings more complex and more revealing. They weren't simply about intimidation. They were about safeguarding, about influence, and about navigating a world where the lines between public scrutiny and private life blur constantly. Consider the broader implications. The child, born into a family whose every move is scrutinized, becomes a focal point for public debate, media analysis, and internal palace dynamics. The recordings suggest that Meghan was acutely aware of this, and her words were carefully crafted to manage the situation. Andrew and Fergie realized that the stakes weren't just about secrecy. They were about managing perception, controlling narrative, and protecting a child who had already become a symbol in the public eye. The insider, listening to these veiled warnings, faced an almost impossible dilemma. Their responsibility was immense: how to protect the child, honor the family, and maintain their own ethical standards under pressure. Every choice carried consequences, and the recordings made it clear that failure to act, or to act incorrectly, would have repercussions. Andrew and Fergie understood this complexity intimately. They had seen the demands of palace life, the scrutiny, and the delicate balance of loyalty and responsibility. But hearing the recordings made it visceral, immediate, and personal. What struck Fergie most was the psychological precision. Meghan's language wasn't just a reflection of concern, it was a demonstration of strategic foresight. She understood the potential vulnerabilities of the insider, the consequences of exposure, and the importance of shaping behavior subtly but effectively. The tapes, according to Andrew and Fergie, were not accidental. They were designed, intentional, and impactful. The stakes were clear: Archie's privacy, the family's reputation, and the insider's responsibility were all in play. Andrew, taking a broader view, considered the ripple effects. If these words, these subtle threats, were to become public, the fallout could be enormous. Media scrutiny, public debate, and internal palace consequences would all follow. Yet, they also realized that ignoring the recordings was not an option. The stakes were too high, the potential consequences too serious, and the moral responsibility undeniable. This was not a question of loyalty to an image or public perception. It was a question of protecting truth, integrity, and, above all, the well-being of a child. As they continued listening, one moment stood out. A phrase, delivered with calm precision, hinted at consequences for anyone failing to comply with the expectations implied in the recording. It was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that in the high-stakes environment of the palace, even words left unsaid can carry tremendous weight. Andrew and Fergie exchanged a glance, understanding the full gravity of the situation. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were immediate, personal, and potentially explosive. Fergie's voice, almost a whisper, captured their shared realization. This isn't just about information. It's about control, influence, and the consequences for everyone involved. And it's all centered on that child. Andrew nodded, recognizing that the complexity of the situation required careful consideration. This was no ordinary scandal, no simple breach of protocol. It was a multidimensional conflict involving psychology, morality, and the fragile web of relationships within the royal family. By the end of the evening, Andrew and Fergie reached a consensus. The stakes behind Archie's birth were monumental. Every decision, every word, every action had the potential to shape not just the child's life, but the perception and integrity of the monarchy itself. The recordings had revealed a world of subtle threats, strategic influence, and protective instinct that few could ever fully comprehend. And they knew that what came next would require courage, wisdom, and careful navigation. And then the aide spoke again, quietly, almost reverently. There's one final segment you need to hear. It's the most revealing of all, and it might change everything. Andrew and Fergie looked at each other, understanding immediately that their journey into the tapes and the stakes they illuminated was far from over. The palace is more than a home. It is a kingdom of influence, a network of power, and a battlefield where the smallest move can send ripples far beyond expectation. Every gesture, every conversation, every carefully phrased word carries consequence. And for Andrew and Fergie, the recordings had revealed a side of Meghan Markle that showed exactly how power can be exercised subtly, strategically, and sometimes mercilessly. But these weren't just isolated moments. They were part of a much larger game being played inside the palace, a game where alliances, loyalties, and stakes were constantly shifting. To understand the significance, one must understand the palace itself. Its corridors are filled with history, tradition, and unspoken rules. Every member, from the most senior to the newest arrival, navigates a labyrinth of expectations. Authority is rarely exerted overtly. It is implied, suggested, and reinforced through subtle influence. Andrew and Fergie knew this well. They had experienced firsthand the nuances of this environment, the unspoken hierarchies, the subtle tests of loyalty, and the delicate dance of maintaining appearances while managing private truths. The recordings revealed Meghan as a participant in this intricate dance, fully aware of the levers of influence she could pull. Her words to the insider were calculated, carefully measured, and strategic. There were moments where maternal concern was interwoven with implied consequences, signaling that actions, or inactions, had meaning beyond the immediate conversation. Andrew leaned back in his chair as he listened, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. Fergie's hand rested lightly on the table, her expression a mix of astonishment and concern. Both understood immediately. This was about control, influence, and strategy, executed with precision. Power plays in the palace are rarely about public declarations. They are subtle, quiet, and often invisible to those outside the walls. A raised eyebrow during a meeting, a carefully chosen phrase, or even a pause in conversation can carry immense weight. Meghan's alleged approach, as captured on tape, was a textbook example of this subtlety. Andrew and Fergie realized that what might have sounded innocuous to an untrained ear was, in fact, a series of deliberate nudges designed to steer behavior, reinforce compliance, and establish influence over the insider. Fergie spoke first, breaking the silence in the dimly lit room where they were reviewing the tapes. "This isn't just about words. It's about positioning, strategy, and leverage," she said softly. "She's playing the palace game, and she's playing it well." Andrew nodded in agreement. He had always recognized the importance of understanding intention, context, and consequences. The recordings had laid bare a sophisticated awareness of hierarchy, relationships, and the subtleties of influence, a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond simple communication. The palace insider, meanwhile, was caught squarely in the middle of these power dynamics. Their position required them to balance competing interests, maintain loyalty, and navigate ethical considerations, all while under the subtle pressure of veiled threats. Andrew and Fergie understood the stakes for this individual. Missteps could carry consequences for relationships, career, and, in some cases, personal well-being. The recordings made clear that the insider was not just a passive listener, but an active participant in a high-stakes chess game where every move mattered. In one particularly tense segment, Meghan allegedly referenced information only the insider would know, highlighting both her awareness and strategic foresight.